Every night just before closing, an old woman walked into the store. No cart, no wallet, just hunger she couldn't hide. Ryan Carter, a broke single father working the late shift, quietly paid for her food every single time. He never told anyone. He couldn't afford to, and he knew it. His manager had already warned him twice. The third time she made it official. He was suspended. No income, no backup plan. Nothing. Then the next morning, a black luxury sedan pulled up in front of his apartment. A young woman in a tailored coat stepped out, and she was looking for him. The store was quiet at that hour. Most nights by 11, the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator units and the occasional car rolling through the parking lot outside. Ryan Carter had worked the closing shift at Grover's Convenience long enough that the silence felt familiar, not peaceful, just empty. He restocked shelves, wiped down the counter, and checked the clock more times than he could count. The job didn't pay well. It paid just enough, and that distinction mattered more than most people understood. Ryan was 41, lean in the way that came from skipping meals rather than discipline. His hands were rough. His eyes carried the kind of tiredness that sleep alone couldn't fix. He had been working at Grover's for 3 years, picking up extra shifts whenever they were available, covering for coworkers who called in sick, doing everything the right way without complaint. He wasn't looking for praise. He just needed the hours. His apartment was 20 minutes away by bus, 1 bedroom, rent due on the 1st. He kept a running list in his head of what he owed, what was coming in, and exactly how much space existed between those two numbers. The space was thin. It had always been thin. But he managed, and managing, he had learned, was its own kind of strength. Clara Benson had been the store manager for 6 years. She was efficient, precise, and entirely unsentimental about it. She ran the store the way she ran everything, by the numbers, by the policy manual, and with very little patience for deviation. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't soft either. She expected her staff to follow the rules, and in her experience, the rules existed for a reason. When she spoke, she expected to be heard. Ryan had never given her a reason to doubt that until recently. The first time the old woman came in, Ryan almost didn't notice her. It was a Wednesday close to midnight. She moved slowly through the door, wearing a coat that was too light for the season, her white hair loose around her shoulders. She walked the aisles without picking anything up, as if she had forgotten why she came. Ryan watched from behind the counter, unsure whether to approach. Eventually, she made her way to the prepared food section near the back sandwiches. Soup cups, things that required no preparation, and stood there looking at them with an expression he couldn't quite name. It wasn't indecision. It was something closer to defeat. He walked over and asked if she needed help. She looked up at him startled and said she was just looking. He could see that she was hungry. He could also see that she had no purse, no wallet, nothing. He picked up a sandwich and a small cup of soup and told her those were on the house. She tried to refuse. He told her not to worry about it, put them in a bag, and walked her gently to a stool near the counter so she could eat without standing. He paid for both items out of his own pocket before the end of his shift. $9.40. He didn't think twice about it. She came back the following week, then again 3 days after that. Her name, he eventually learned, was Margaret. She never offered a last name, and he didn't press. She was in her mid-70s, he guessed, though some nights she looked older. She didn't say much, a few words here and there, sometimes a question that didn't quite connect to what they'd been talking about, sometimes just a quiet thank you before she left. Ryan noticed that she never seemed entirely sure where she was going when she walked back out into the night. He noticed, but he didn't know what to do with that yet. He kept paying, every time out of his own pocket. A sandwich, a soup cup, sometimes a bottle of water. He kept it small so Clara wouldn't see it on inventory. He wasn't trying to steal from the store he always paid, but he knew that drawing attention to it would cause problems he wasn't prepared to deal with. He was right about that. Clara spotted it on a Tuesday. Ryan was handing Margaret a small bag at the counter when Clara came in through the back to start her administrative shift. She watched for a moment, then walked over with her arms crossed, and her expression already settled into something hard. She waited until Margaret had shuffled out the door before she spoke. "How many times has this happened?" Clara asked. Ryan didn't answer right away. He started straightening items on the counter, keeping his hands busy. "Ryan," her voice had an edge to it, "I'm asking you a direct question. How many times have you given that woman free food?" "I paid for it," he said. "Every time, out of my own pocket." Clara's expression didn't soften. She told him it didn't matter who paid. What mattered was that he was turning the store into something it wasn't. A shelter, a soup kitchen, a place where someone could walk in off the street and expect to be fed for free. She said that if word got out, they'd have a line of people at the door every night. She said she understood that he meant well, but meaning well wasn't a policy. Ryan listened. He kept his face neutral. When she finished, he told her he understood. But he didn't stop. Margaret came back 4 nights later. This time, she was worse. She moved with more difficulty, her hands trembling slightly as she held the door. When Ryan greeted her, she looked at him as if she were trying to place him, as if the face in front of her was almost familiar, but not quite landing. He guided her to the stool again and got her food without making an event of it. She ate slowly, both hands wrapped around the soup cup for warmth. At one point, she looked up and said, "I used to make soup like this. My daughter loved it." Then she went quiet, and Ryan didn't push. By the time she left, he had already decided something without quite putting it into words. He wasn't going to stop, not because he had some grand sense of mission, and not because he thought it would lead anywhere. He was going to keep doing it because it was the only thing in front of him that felt unambiguous. The job paid too little. The rent was too high. The margin between stability and collapse was too narrow. But this he could do. This cost him $9, maybe $12, and it mattered to someone. That was enough. Clara found out again 2 weeks later. Ryan had been careful, but not careful enough. She had reviewed the shift logs and noticed the patterned small transactions at odd hours, always near closing, always during Ryan's shift. She called him into the back office before his shift started on a Thursday evening and laid it out plainly. She told him she had warned him once. She told him that this was a formal notice. If it happened again, she would be escalating it to the district manager and recommending a write-up, possibly worse. Ryan sat across from her at the small metal desk that barely fit in the back room. He looked at the wall for a moment, then back at her. He thought about the woman in the too light coat. He thought about the expression on her face when she stood in front of the soup cups. He thought about his own budget, his own rent, the numbers he kept running in his head every night on the bus home. "I understand," he said again. Clara held his gaze. "Do you?" "Yes," he said. "I do." She let him start his shift. He paid for Margaret's food again that Friday. He did it quietly, without hesitation, without drama. He rang it through, covered the amount himself, and handed over the bag. Margaret thanked him in the distracted way she sometimes did, and he walked her to the door and watched her go. The parking lot outside was wet from an earlier rain. The streetlights caught the puddles in orange and white. He stood there for a moment after she disappeared around the corner, and the feeling in his chest was not triumph or righteousness. It was simpler than that. It was just the feeling of having done the one clear thing. He went back inside and finished his shift. He didn't know that Clara had been watching from the back camera feed. He didn't know she had written it down the time the transaction the bag handed over the counter. He didn't know that she had already sent an email to the district manager before he had even clocked out. He found out the next morning when she called him. She told him his hours were being cut effective immediately. Not a firing, not yet, but a reduction. 3 shifts a week instead of 5. She said it was a staffing decision. He knew it wasn't. He said nothing. He thanked her for letting him know and hung up the phone and sat at his kitchen table in the gray morning light and did the math in his head. 3 shifts a week. That was roughly $420 less per month. He already knew what was in his account. He already knew what was coming due. He sat there long enough that the coffee he'd made went cold. Then he got up, rinsed the mug, and put on his jacket. He had an afternoon shift. He wasn't going to be late. That was who Ryan Carter was, not a man with a plan, not a man with connections or resources or anything resembling a safety net. Just a man who showed up, who did the small thing in front of him even when the cost was real, who kept paying for sandwiches and soup even as his own margins got thinner, because the alternative was to become the kind of person who saw someone hungry and looked away. And that was the one thing he was not willing to do. He didn't frame it in those terms. He didn't frame it at all. He just put on his jacket, picked up his keys, and walked out the door into a morning that did not yet know what it was about to set in motion. 3 shifts a week turned out to be harder than Ryan had calculated. Not just financially, though that was real enough. It was the hours themselves, the extra time sitting in the apartment with nothing but the numbers in his head and the particular silence of a place that felt smaller every day. He picked up odd jobs where he could. He helped a neighbor move furniture one weekend for $40. He sold a jacket he hadn't worn in 2 years. He adjusted the way he always adjusted by quietly removing things from his life until what remained was only what was necessary. He still went to Grover's. He still showed up early, worked clean, and gave Clara nothing to point to beyond the one thing she already knew. And Margaret still came. If anything, she came more often now, 3 times in 2 weeks, then twice in a single week. Ryan noticed that her condition was shifting in a way that was harder to ignore. Some nights, she seemed steadier. She'd recognize him quickly, say a few words that connected, eat her food without incident. Other nights, she arrived looking lost before she'd even cleared the doorway. Her coat misaligned her eyes, scanning the store, as if the fluorescent light itself was unfamiliar. He started watching for her arrival around 10:30, positioning himself near the front so he could reach her before she wandered too far into the aisles confused. Clara noticed the pattern, too. She didn't say anything directly, but Ryan could feel the shift in the way she moved through the store. On nights, they overlapped a little slower, near the front, a little more deliberate in where she positioned herself. She was watching. He knew she was watching. He didn't change anything. The pressure came in other forms. Clara began scheduling him for the least desirable shifts, the dead midweek overnights, with minimal foot traffic, where there was nothing to do but clean and wait. She stopped approving his requests to cover other employees' shifts, which had been a small but meaningful source of extra income. She didn't yell, didn't threaten again directly. She just made the environment incrementally worse in ways that were each individually defensible and collectively unmistakable. Ryan absorbed it without comment. He had been in situations where making noise only made things worse, and this felt like one of them. Then came the night that changed the weight of everything. It was a Thursday close to 11. Ryan was behind the counter when the door opened and Margaret walked in. He knew immediately that something was different. She wasn't just moving slowly. She was moving without direction, turning slightly, as if uncertain which way was forward. Her coat was buttoned, wrong one side higher than the other. Her hair was uncombed. She made it 3 steps inside, and then stopped looking at the floor, and Ryan came around the counter without waiting. He reached her side and said her name quietly. She looked up at him, and the expression on her face was one he hadn't seen before. Not confusion exactly, but something closer to blankness, like a room with the lights off. He asked if she was all right. She told him she didn't know where she was. He asked her name gently to see what she'd say. She looked at him for a long moment and said she couldn't remember. Ryan kept his voice level. He guided her to the stool at the counter and got her a cup of water first, then warmed a soup cup and set it in front of her. He stayed close, not crowding her, just present. She ate slowly, and the blankness in her eyes shifted not to clarity exactly, but to something softer. At one point, she looked at her own hands, as if she were checking that they were still hers. He didn't push her to talk. He just made sure she was warm and fed, and not alone. After about 20 minutes, he asked if she had anyone he could call. She looked at him again with that same uncertain expression, and said she thought she had a daughter. She couldn't remember the daughter's name. She said she thought the girl was very busy. Ryan wrote nothing down because she gave him nothing concrete, no name, no number, no address. He asked if she knew where she lived. She said she used to live somewhere with a garden. That was all she could give him. He couldn't leave her outside. He knew that much. He kept her at the counter until clothes made sure she was warm, and when his shift ended, he walked her to a bench under a covered bus stop 2 blocks away, where there was light and shelter, and he waited with her until she seemed more settled. She eventually said she thought she could find her way from there. He wasn't fully convinced, but she said it with enough steadiness that he made the call to let her go. He watched until she turned the corner, then stood there in the cold for another minute before walking to the bus stop himself. On the bus ride home, he sat in the back and looked out the window at the passing street lights and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a while. Not quite fear, but the outer edge of it. He didn't know who Margaret was. He didn't know where she went at night, or who, if anyone, was looking out for her. He had been handing her sandwiches and soup for weeks, but he had never followed that thought to its logical conclusion. What was actually happening to her when she left the store? Where did she go? He didn't have answers, and the not knowing sat heavily in a way that food and warmth alone couldn't fix. He went back the next day, and the day after that. She didn't come in on either of those nights, and the absence itself was its own kind of weight. Clara found out about the Thursday incident through the store's internal camera system. Ryan hadn't hidden it. There was nothing to hide. He had done nothing wrong, but he also hadn't reported. It hadn't filed anything. Hadn't flagged it with management the way policy technically required when a customer appeared to be in medical distress on the premises. Clara pulled the footage. She watched it, and then she called Ryan in before his Saturday shift and told him she was placing him on suspension. She laid it out without raising her voice. He had been warned. He had been formally notified. He had continued the behavior regardless. And now, beyond just the food, he had spent close to 40 minutes attending to a non-customer during business hours, neglecting his counter duties, and using store resources, the soup cup, the water, without authorization. She told him the suspension was effective immediately. She told him she would be in contact within 72 hours about next steps. Ryan sat across from her at the small metal desk again. The same desk. The same narrow back room with the single overhead light that buzzed faintly when the building's HVAC kicked on. He looked at Clara, and she looked back at him with the particular expression of someone who had made their decision before entering the room and was now simply delivering it. He didn't argue. He had known in some part of himself that this was coming. He had made a choice, and the choice had a cost, and the cost was now sitting in front of him in plain language. He nodded, stood up, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and left. The walk to the bus stop took 7 minutes. He spent most of it doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to. No income. Rent in 11 days. The thin margin he had been managing was now not a margin at all. It was a deficit. He had no savings worth the name. He had no family nearby to call. He had the $40 from the furniture job, and whatever was left in his checking account after last week's groceries, which was not much. He sat on the bus and kept his eyes forward and let the reality of it settle. He had done the right thing. He believed that without reservation. But believing something was right didn't insulate you from the consequences of it. And sitting there on the bus in the middle of a gray Saturday afternoon, the consequences were all he could see. For the first time since this had started, he asked himself the question he'd been avoiding. Not whether he had done the right thing, he knew the answer to that. The question was smaller and more honest than that had it mattered. Margaret was still out there somewhere. He still didn't know her last name. He didn't know who her daughter was, or whether anyone was looking for her, or whether she was safe at that moment. He had spent weeks paying for her food out of a budget that couldn't absorb it. and now he had no job to go back to, and he still didn't know if any of it had made a real difference to her life, or just to his own sense of himself. That was the question, and he didn't have a clean answer. He got home, unlocked the apartment, and sat at the kitchen table. He didn't turn the lights on right away. He just sat in the gray afternoon light coming through the window and let the quiet press in from all sides. He thought about calling someone, but there was no one who could change the situation. He thought about sending Clara an email, but he had nothing to say that would help his case. He had no leverage, no appeal, no next move that was obvious to him. He eventually got up and made coffee. He sat back down. He went to bed early because there was nothing else to do, and because the tiredness he felt was the kind that settled in the bones rather than the eyes. He set no alarm. He had nowhere to be. The next morning, he woke to the sound of a car outside a quiet engine, expensive in the way that read as deliberate rather than accidental. He lay there for a moment, not thinking much of it. Then he heard footsteps on the walkway below his window, measured and direct. Then a knock at his door. Not aggressive, just certain. The knock of someone who already knew this was the right address and was simply waiting to be let in. Ryan got up. He pulled on a shirt, ran a hand over his face, and walked to the door. When he opened it, a woman was standing on the other side. She was younger than him by a decade at least, dressed in a coat that cost more than his monthly rent. Her dark hair pulled back cleanly. She looked at him with eyes that were sharp and steady, and carrying something he couldn't immediately identify. Not anger, not judgment. Something more complicated than either. "Are you Ryan Carter?" she asked. He said that he was. "My name is Evelyn Hale," she said. "Margaret is my mother. I think we need to talk." Ryan stepped back from the door without a word and let her in. It wasn't a conscious decision so much as the only thing that made sense. Evelyn Hale walked into his apartment with the kind of composure that came from being accustomed to difficult situations, and she took in the space without comment, the small kitchen, the single window, the jacket still draped over the chair where he'd left it the night before. She didn't sit until he gestured toward the table. He poured 2 cups of coffee, because it was the only thing he had to offer, and they sat across from each other in the gray morning light while she began to talk. Margaret Hale was 74 years old and had been living with Alzheimer's for almost 3 years. Evelyn explained this without softness, but also without detachment, the kind of voice that had practiced being steady around a subject that was anything but. She said that Margaret had a full-time caregiver at her home on the north side of the city, and that the arrangement had been working until it wasn't. 6 weeks ago, Margaret had begun slipping out during the evening hours, not dramatically, not through any kind of confrontation, but quietly, the way the disease worked, walking out the door as if she had somewhere to be, and moving through the city on instinct and muscle memory. The caregiver had reported it. Evelyn had responded by adding a second caregiver for the evening shift. Margaret had still managed to leave twice more before they found a system that reliably kept her safe. But before that system was in place, Margaret had been walking. And one of the places she had walked to more than once was Grover's Convenience. Evelyn had learned this through the investigation she'd initiated after the first disappearance. She had hired a firm to trace her mother's movements, using city camera footage, business security systems, and whatever else was legally accessible. What they found was a pattern. Margaret had visited 7 different locations over the course of her wanderings. At 5 of them, she had been turned away store employees, a diner staff member, a security guard at a pharmacy who had called the police rather than offer her a seat. At one location, she had simply been ignored until she left on her own. At Grover's Convenience, she had been helped, every single time. Evelyn set her coffee cup down and looked at Ryan directly. She told him that the investigators had pulled the store's external camera footage and cross-referenced it with the internal feed obtained through the store's parent company. She told him that she had watched herself the footage of Ryan paying for her mother's food, guiding her to a stool, sitting with her, keeping her company, without making her feel like a problem to be solved. She told him she had watched the Thursday night footage, the 40-minute stretch where he had stayed with her mother, when Margaret couldn't remember her own name more than once. Ryan listened to all of this without interrupting. He kept his hands wrapped around the coffee cup. There was something disorienting about being described from the outside, like that having things he had done alone quietly in a fluorescent-lit store at midnight, laid out in precise detail by a stranger sitting in his kitchen. He hadn't thought of any of it as remarkable. He had just done what was in front of him. Evelyn told him she also knew about the suspension. She knew about the formal warning before it. She knew about the cut hours and the escalation to the district manager. She said she had obtained Clara Benson's written reports through the same process, and she had read them in full. She said this without anger in her voice, but her jaw was set in a way that suggested the anger existed somewhere beneath the surface, contained by discipline rather than absent. "I want to make this right," Evelyn said. "All of it." Ryan looked at her. He asked what that meant. She told him. She had already spoken to the district manager of the chain that owned Grover's that morning, before coming to his apartment. She had communicated that the store's handling of the situation, the warnings, the shift, cuts, the suspension had been documented, and that she intended to pursue a formal complaint unless it was resolved promptly and completely. The district manager had been cooperative. Ryan's suspension was being reversed. His full schedule was being reinstated, and the income he had lost during the period of reduced hours, as well as the suspension period, would be compensated not by the store, but by Evelyn directly, because she felt the debt was personal. She slid an envelope across the table. Ryan didn't open it immediately. She told him the amount inside covered 6 weeks of the income differential from the cut hours, plus the suspension period, plus an additional sum that she described simply as recognition for the care he had provided. He still didn't open it. He looked at the envelope, then at her, and asked if she was certain about this. Evelyn said she was. Then she told him the second part. She ran a logistics and property management company with offices in 4 cities. She was not going to insult him by pretending his situation at Grover's was now fully repaired. She knew what a minimum wage retail job looked like from the inside, and she knew that even with the schedule restored, the margin he was living on was not a margin at all. She had a position available in her company's operations division. It was a coordinator role, scheduling vendor communication facility oversight. It paid more than twice what he was making at Grover's, with benefits and a fixed schedule. She had looked at what she knew about him before coming here, and she believed he could do the job. She said she was not offering it out of pity. She said she did not do things out of pity. She was offering it because she had seen how he operated under pressure, and that was information she took seriously. Ryan sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street. He thought about the bus rides home, the arithmetic he ran in his head every night, the jacket he'd sold the neighbor's furniture he'd moved for $40. He thought about all the ways he had trimmed his life down to its bare structure and kept going anyway, not because it was easy, but because stopping wasn't something he knew how to do. He told her he would take the job. Evelyn nodded, as if she had expected that answer. They talked through the details for another half hour. Start date, the office location, what the first weeks would look like. She was direct and organized, and Ryan found himself responding in kind. By the time she stood to leave, the conversation had shifted entirely from what had happened to what came next, and that shift felt right in a way he hadn't anticipated. At the door, Evelyn stopped. She turned back and looked at him with an expression that was different from everything that had come before it, quieter, less composed, more honest. She said that her mother was safe now, that the care situation had been corrected, and Margaret was stable as the disease allowed. She said that on good days, Margaret still talked about the man at the store who gave her soup. She didn't remember his name. She didn't always remember the store, but she remembered the feeling of being handed something warm and being allowed to sit down without being made to feel like a burden. She remembered that. And Evelyn said that for someone whose memory was dissolving from the inside out, holding onto a feeling was not nothing. It was in fact a great deal. Ryan didn't say anything. He just nodded. Evelyn left, and he closed the door, and he stood in the hallway for a moment before walking back to the kitchen table and sitting down and finally opening the envelope. The amount inside was more than he had made in 4 months at Grover's. He set it down on the table and looked at it for a long time. 2 days later, Clara Benson called him. He almost didn't pick up. When he did, she was quieter than he'd ever heard her. She told him she had received communication from the district manager regarding the reversal of his suspension and the complaint that had been filed. She said that she had also been informed that several of her decisions over the preceding weeks were being reviewed. She said she wanted to call him personally, which was not something she was required to do. She told him she had been operating within the guidelines she had been given. She said that, and then she stopped, and in the silence that followed, Ryan understood that she knew it wasn't enough, that operating within guidelines was not the same as being right. She said she had watched the same footage Evelyn had referenced. She said watching it had been, and here she seemed to search for the word instructive. Ryan told her he didn't hold it against her. He meant it mostly. He understood what it looked like from her position. He understood the pressures that came from managing a store on thin margins with corporate oversight and the constant threat of liability. He understood that her decisions had their own logic. He just hadn't been able to follow that logic to where it led, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Clara said she appreciated him saying that. She said she hoped the new position would work out well for him. Then she said something he didn't expect, that she had recommended to the district manager that the store implement a limited food assistance policy for customers in clear need to be managed discreetly and logged properly. She said it was something she should have considered earlier, rather than treating every deviation as a liability. Ryan didn't know what to say to that, so he just said he thought it was a good idea. They ended the call without any warmth, exactly, but without bitterness. Either two people who had been on opposite sides of something and had both come through. It changed in ways they were still working out. His first day at Evelyn's company fell on a Monday, 3 weeks after she had knocked on his door. The office was on the 14th floor of a building, downtown clean lines, real windows, a break room with a coffee machine that worked reliably. His desk had a view of the street below. He spent the morning in orientation filling out paperwork, meeting the team he would be coordinating with. No one treated him like an outsider. No one knew his story, and he didn't volunteer it. He was just a new coordinator starting his first week learning the systems. At lunch, he sat by the window with a sandwich he had brought from home and looked out at the city below the streets, the intersections, the ordinary motion of people moving through their days. He thought about Margaret in her house on the north side on whatever kind of day she was having. He thought about the soup cup she used to hold with both hands. He thought about the fact that she still remembered the feeling even when the memory itself had gone. And he thought about what that meant, not in any grand sense, but in the small, plain sense of it. A feeling could outlast the facts of the moment that created it. That seemed important, though he couldn't have said exactly why. He finished his sandwich, folded the bag, and went back to his desk. He had work to do. Kindness is not about what you have. It is about what you choose to give when you have very little left. In a world where turning away is easy and often goes unnoticed, the person who stops, who pays for the soup, who stays the extra hour, who does the quiet thing no one asked them to do, that person changes something. Sometimes they change another person's life. Sometimes, without expecting it, they change their own. Ryan Carter did not set out to be found. He just refused to look away. And in the end, that was everything.